comp plan. As we're looking at the material we're talking about today, climate change is not included right now as a mandatory element. There are considerations that are moving through the legislature, but at this point, and there is guidance that has been provided by the Department of Commerce related to how to create a climate change element. However, the City of Lakewood has already pursued energy and climate change as an optional element in the comprehensive plan, and this has been something that they've engaged with before. And this is something that is important to highlight, that in some ways Lakewood has been ahead of the curve compared to a lot of other cities in Washington state. What is also important to highlight here is the city is also expanding and making the comprehensive plan more comprehensive. There are some elements that we won't get into regarding concepts like military compatibility, which is an important consideration given that Lakewood is right next door to Joint Base Lewis McChord. But there are other elements that have been considered as part of this. There are considerations, for example, with its HB 1777, I believe, with coordination with tribal planning and other concepts that Lakewood is really keen on engaging on to make sure that this is an effective plan going forward. So while that's a pretty broad statement about the overall effort, our work with Lakewood is specifically targeted to look at a few different things. For our discussion today, it's primarily with the housing element and the energy and climate change element. What's also of note here is that we're looking at a sub-area plan as well for the Tillicum neighborhood, which is an area that is in the southwest of the city, which is an area that will be subject to potential growth pressures, is an area where equity and consideration of anti-displacement policies is a consideration. So that's relevant as well as we're going forward and talking about equity and anti-displacement policies. But there are other things such as an update to the critical areas ordinance that will also be relevant for housing. But overall, we're looking at multiple elements that may have an impact on housing and on climate change as well. So I'll go through these quickly because folks around the table have probably heard a lot of this before, but in the context of comprehensive plan updates that are currently being made are there are a number of changes to the Growth Management Act that have occurred over the past few years that are very much relevant. With 1220, there are new housing targets that I'll get into in a minute that Lakewood will be planning towards, as well as the need for additional anti-displacement policies. And as part of this, there is a need to accommodate a broader set of permanent supportive housing and transitional housing in the community, as well as acknowledging emergency shelters and emergency housing in additional areas. Now, this is something that the city is currently engaged with addressing, but part of our effort is to ensure that everything is, fully in compliance with 1220, with consideration of anti-displacement and equity and acknowledgement of racially disparate impacts going forward. There is also the change that has resulted from 1110, which in some respects has addressed a lot of considerations about accommodating middle housing in different areas of the city. This has caused a bit of bit of complexity with respect to understanding where development capacity has been occurring, where development capacity is currently available. But this is something that we're looking at acknowledging as part of growth targets under 1220 and how much growth the city can accommodate and where it can accommodate it. Finally, I mean, there is also the need to address accessory dwelling units, both in terms of development regulations and in terms of policies in the comprehensive plan. There have been a number of changes that have occurred that need to be acknowledged as part of regular policy. So that is a quick high-level update about you know, the context in which we're engaging with these updates. Tiffany, I'm going to go into a little more detail about housing and climate change. If there's anything, though, that you would like to add to that.
No, please continue. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'll also throw it out to the broader crowd. And James, I noticed that you unmuted yourself and you're on camera. I didn't know if you had any questions or... Maybe not, but so at this high level, though, does anybody have any questions or any anything to broach right away?
If I could actually really quickly, Andrew, I will throw out to everyone that obviously your organization works in more than just the city of Lakewood. You're across Pierce County, and your individual members may actually build outside of that as well, or fund projects outside of Pierce County and its cities. This process is something that all jurisdictions in the county are currently engaging in. These bills affect everybody depending on size. So for instance, Lakewood, University Place, and Puyallup are all considered what are called core cities by the Puget Sound Regional Council. And then depending on their population, these three cities, as well as others, are having to follow these same laws for ADUs and units per lot that Andrew just went through. So you can hear this directly related to Lakewood, but all of these issues are coming up in all of the jurisdictions. So if you're trying to figure out how to be efficient in your comments, there's probably going to be some common themes that you might want to submit, not just to Lakewood, but elsewhere as well. Thanks.
Great. Okay, so just to give you an idea about housing in Lakewood, this is a simplified map of residential and mixed-use zoning categories in the city. And what you can notice is that there is a lot of yellow on this map. The city is, like many other communities, largely single-family zoning, although there are individual neighborhoods that have more opportunities for mixed use and multifamily development. Some of the major focuses for recent development planning have especially been around the downtown, which is in the center of Lakewood, as well as Lakewood Station, which is an area that is close to high capacity transit. Now, as was mentioned before, with the passage of 1110 and with other changes in planning regulations, one of the big focuses of changes to land use policy will be on addressing capacity in these areas, accommodating more middle housing in traditionally single-family neighborhoods, and encouraging more housing production. Oh, and Amanda, just with respect to that question, there are deadlines that are associated with implementing these changes in the zoning code, which it differs from bill to bill. It's 6 months to a year after the deadline for the comp plan, I believe. So, but these bills have already passed. They're already part of the statutory requirements for the comp plans, though. Yeah. Thank you, Tiffany, on that. So this has been part of the complexity with addressing housing needs in Lakewood, that there, you know, the shift towards state requirements that require more middle housing in single family areas, as well as the greater focus on development mixed use centers. All of this, you know, we're working to consider as part of the comprehensive plan and looking at revisions to that comp plan. One other thing to acknowledge is that in the past, the rate of housing growth in the city has been relatively nominal. And I will note, just before Tiffany mentions it, the housing capacity in this figure on the right is a previous number that has not been updated yet. But in looking at the past 12 years, there's been relatively modest housing growth in the community. That's related to a number of different things. The city is all in all largely built out. There are some areas for additional development and infill. However, in looking at future growth targets, this will require a significant increase in housing production overall. And if we take a look at as well kind of the breakdown of where housing production has been, you know, housing production has been slow when you compare it with other communities in the area. If you're looking at Fife or University Place, you know, the overall growth in more multifamily types has been generally comparable. You know, growth in multifamily housing hasn't necessarily been as high in Lakewood as in Tacoma to the north, but there has been some development of duplex and townhome development that should be noted here. But just to note about the figures on the right, the top has absolute values about the number of housing units that were completed according to OFM from 2012 to 2020. The bottom just has those on a proportionate basis, just to compare the percentages of growth. So this is important to keep in mind, because as we're moving forward, looking at middle housing development, looking at multifamily housing development in some of the centers in Lakewood, we want to, that's an important comment that I'll get into in 1 second, but it's important to just understand that, for one, this is what growth has been like up to this point, and then there does need to be somewhat of a shift in going forward. That there does need to be an acknowledgement that this does need to move less. This needs to be moving from single family to plex and multifamily style development. And Lydia, that's an interesting question. Do you mind? Would you want to address that a bit more?
Sure. And Lydia, if you wouldn't mind restating your question, since we're recording, those that are going to be reviewing the recording after the event will not be able to see our chat. So if you don't mind just restating your question, that would be great.
Absolutely. So my question is, in part, part of the low housing growth might be due to the fact that there's been a big loss of housing in Lakewood. I'm thinking in particular on Southwest 150th, where a lot of low-income housing, multi-family housing has been lost due to all the warehouses that are being built there. And a lot of low-income people, especially people of color, have been displaced in that neighborhood. And so it seems like this HB 1220 is like closing the door after all the livestock got out, because there already been a lot of people displaced and a lot of housing that's been lost. And so housing growth is made up of actual increases in housing as well as decreases in housing. And it seems to me that the slow growth is because there's been a loss of housing.
Yeah, and one thing to acknowledge is that these are completed units, but this does not include losses in units. So that's a fair point. With 1220, the effort was to peg the targets as the amount of the amount of new housing, and we'll get into this in a minute, but essentially the amount of new housing that needs to be developed from 2020 to 2044 to meet expected needs. So it's, I think that it is important to acknowledge that we are working in part from a deficit in cities across the state. But I think I understand the sentiment, and I think that it's important to understand that it's that we are working from a situation where we've just had a complete lack of housing overall. We haven't had the housing development that's necessary. We haven't protected opportunities for affordable housing in many communities. So yeah, I don't quite know if it's closing the barn door after the horse got out, because I think that you know, we still have an opportunity to make change and to address the low-income housing that's remaining, and provide opportunities for additional, like for trying to achieve additional development of low-income housing units. So don't quite know if I answered your question or comment with that, but there are a few slides that are coming up that may help to reinforce the points that I was trying to make. But with this, though, I mean, housing production has been low statewide, and if we're looking at how housing affordability has changed at a local level, what these figures work to demonstrate is comparing rents and comparing housing prices with the city's median family income. And this is an important thing to look at, just to compare in one chart both general growth in housing costs as well as growth in housing costs relative to median family income at a city level. And what's readily apparent here is that, you know, we do see in Lakewood a pretty significant increase in rents since 2014, like we've seen in a lot of other places, and significant growth in home value as compared to median family income since 2012. And these aren't pegged to county median family income. This does come in at about 60 to 80% of median family income for rents, which is important to note for affordable housing programs. But this is an important measure to just indicate that housing affordability has been going down, and there does need to be some policies put in place to address this. And then finally, in looking at the targets under 1220, these aren't finalized by Pierce County Council, and they are looking to have a final hearing on this on June 20th. Tiffany, I'm trying to remember the exact date of the council meeting for that.
That's correct. The emergency housing and permanent supportive and transitional housing was passed out of the Planning Commission on May 31st, and it will be in front of the council for a discussion on June 12th and a public hearing on June 20th.
So to note here, these are targets that are based on Department of Commerce targets to Pierce County, which Pierce County has allocated between different cities and unincorporated areas of Pierce County. And what is important to note here is that this represents a pretty substantial increase in permanent supportive housing, extremely low income housing, and emergency housing, the three bars that are at the bottom. This is pretty significant. And on one hand, the requirements from the state note that the main requirement to reach is to ensure that there is sufficient development capacity available to accommodate all of these housing units, or in the case of emergency housing, the facilities with these beds. However, as we're looking through, this also represents a pretty significant requirement for funding and subsidy, especially for housing at, the very low income band at 50%, 30 to 50%, extremely low income at 0 to 30%, and new emergency and transitional housing. So this is the one figure that is certainly what is involved with a lot of consideration of policy. How do cities leverage resources to try to develop out 1,700 housing units over the next 20 years for, households at 30 to 50% AMI, when in the past there's been very low housing production? How do we leverage the resources that are necessary for that? How do we work on the partnerships that are necessary for that? And in some cases, how do we ensure that this is integrated in with the community, that these are part of mixed income developments, that this is part of broader planning for neighborhoods? So I think that this is one of the places where I wanted to stop to talk about Lakewood in this context, and about how this is all integrated in with the work that you're doing, what you're seeing in other communities, and where to go from here. So I think the first thing is, of the folks that have encountered targets under 1220 before, do you have any reactions to them? What do you think about this approach and these targets generally?
And you can post in the chat, or just raise your hand, or just come off mute and ask your question.
Amanda, great.
Hi, thanks. So just to clarify, these numbers are needing to be approved by Pierce County Council, and you said that that's the date is 6/20.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that right?
That's for, I believe it's the final public hearing for these
Okay.
targets for approval.
Okay. Well, my question is more of like a process question, because I know, like, we just went through the City of Lakewood's like updates to accommodate for affordable housing. How does that play into the numbers here? And what is that? Is there a final date? Sorry, it's a two-part question, because we don't have these numbers finalized, but Lakewood has gone ahead and, like, set kind of laid out like the zoning and the requirements for affordable housing already. So I assume that this is going to be happening in other jurisdictions throughout the county. But now, knowing these numbers and what they're most likely going to be, is it going to change the code that was written for the City of Lakewood around affordable housing zoning? And maybe Tiffany can answer that too.
Yeah, I could take a stab at it, and then Tiffany, if you'd want to address what I missed, that'd be great. So regardless of these targets or not, zoning and certain development regulations under zoning will need to change. Other provisions in 1220 and with 1110 and 1337 mean that right now, in most of the areas in yellow on this map, the state has mandated that most, if not all of these yellow areas will allow 4 units per lot as of right. And there are some where did I put them? Yeah, so, or sorry, 2 units as of right, but 4 if 1 unit is affordable. So that is going to have some change. That's going to result in some changes to zoning anyway. There are also considerations about where emergency shelters and transitional housing and other types of supportive housing can be located. Requirements from the state that will need to be integrated with the city's comp plan and development regulations. So essentially it'll allow for kind of broader access than there was in the past. And Tiffany, maybe you can talk a bit about the changes that have been made recently and what would be expected from the comp plan.
Well, the issue regarding the 2024 comprehensive plan update being complicated by 1220 can't be understated. 1220 said that a number of things needed to change in terms of affordable housing planning, as you all know, and the amount of units at various area median income amounts have been identified in final draft form. They were talked about yesterday by the county council at a committee hearing, and on June 20th, it's anticipated that the county council will adopt the final numbers for the total number of housing units per area median income bracket for not only Lakewood, but all of the jurisdictions. Given the fact that we are where we are in the legislative process, Lakewood made some assumptions with the numbers that it would need to plan for. And those are the basis of what you just heard from Andrew, as well as what was underlying the changes that are now going through in the 2023 comprehensive plan update for Lakewood, saying this is where affordable housing of transitional and permanent supportive housing will be allowed. And here's also where we're going to be providing an overlay, as the way Lakewood's approaching it, for where emergency housing and emergency shelter units can be placed. So just really quickly, the state law says, first of all, permanent supportive and transitional housing happens anywhere where hotels and residential units can happen. So that's all of those areas that Andrew showed you on that residential zoning map, as well as our commercial zones. And then emergency housing and emergency shelter are anywhere, at least anywhere hotels again are allowed in commercial zones. What Lakewood proposed to do and is headed to council for hearing again on June 20th is that in addition to where the commercial zones are located, the city is also saying within 1 mile of transit, emergency shelter and emergency housing units can be built. So these are almost concurrent conversations. They're certainly interrelated, but it's a long-winded answer, Amanda, for you. At this point, the 2023 action count that City of Lakewood is taking for emergency housing shelter, permanent supportive housing, and transitional housing will stand. And unless something unforeseen were to happen with a 2024 legislative action at the state level, this will be done. And then when we get into next year's 2024 updates, it will address the planning for affordable housing citywide at various median income. So hopefully that helps.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you. And the planning that the citing of affordable housing and then the emergency shelter, et cetera, all of that aligns with these numbers, right? So whatever has been proposed is working under the assumption that all of the targets can be met. Is that correct?
In some respects, yes. The way it's coming forward from the Planning Commission is that the decision and recommendation from the commission to expand where emergency housing and shelter can be placed in the city beyond only the commercial areas is because there's this identified 474 units needed in Lakewood. And so trying to allow it to happen in more areas and disperse more equitably across the city rather than strictly along those major commercial corridors. In terms of the permanent supportive units and transitional units, yes, those are also taken into account in the total number that the county council will be adopting on June 20th, and then City of Lakewood will be reacting to.
Thank you.
Yeah, one other thing to note is that the requirements for the city under the comp plan are there are two different considerations to make. The city needs to demonstrate that it has the capacity in the areas that Tiffany was describing to accommodate these types of housing formats. Where it becomes more of a challenge is that when you look at these targets and you consider that in some cases, if you're comparing the number for permanent supportive housing at 1,600 units, and then comparing that to housing production over the past 10 years, it's requiring essentially that the number of permanent supportive units produced over the next about 20 years is essentially the same amount, the same rate of just housing development that's occurred across the entire city over the past 10 years. So this one thing that we really need to reinforce with this is that these are growth targets that are being set, and it involves a very significant increase in development activity in the city over the next 20 years. So. And finally, to wrap it up, but if anybody else has any questions, we can certainly take them.
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
So I guess it follows up on what you're saying, is that how can the city of Lakewood ensure that these growth targets are met other than building them themselves? It seems as though this is an aspirational, maybe just a wish list, because you can zone it, but that doesn't mean anybody's going to build it. So how is this going to actually happen? Because and also, what are the consequences if it doesn't? I mean, what's the enforcement mechanism?
This is okay. This is where it gets complicated, because on one hand, the comp plan is a legal document, and the city needs to fulfill certain requirements, which include putting these targets forward. It also needs to make a good faith effort, both in terms of allocating capacity and providing mechanisms for housing development. And in part, that's, like I was saying before, it's, there are legal requirements for the comp plan. There's also qualifications for, future state level funding that require hitting these targets. The challenge here is that to hit these targets is, I'll be blunt, in some cases, these may be aspirational. And at the state level, there aren't clear mechanisms to provide full support for all of these housing units. Where this becomes important is that the cities that are successful in proactively engaging in addressing these targets will need to have coordination with folks like you. There's no way that any city in the state will be able to accommodate the level of subsidies that are necessary to build all of these units. But in coordinating a stronger strategy to leverage other sources of funding, provide incentives from the city through MFT programs, through parking incentives, anything else. That's where the city is hoping to reach, hoping to work towards these goals. That's the best answer that I can give you. I think that what's important here is that the city needs to provide a roadmap forward. It's hard. it's hard because the money isn't there, and the money needs to come from somewhere beyond the city, because the city does not have the financial resources to support that level of subsidy. That's probably not the most diplomatic answer, but we're being straightforward here.
So have you considered vacancy taxes as a stick? And also, have you considered limiting private equity investment as a stick to sort of prevent this kind of demand on housing that's making it less and less affordable?
In what we've seen from market statistics, we don't know how much of this demand we would be able to accommodate if we were cracking down on vacancy rates. To some extent, maybe, but we're not going to be able to bridge the gap. It's production that needs to get to that point. With respect to levying additional taxes, this is also a place where we need to be very strategic in both what we propose and the support that we can get for it. So again, this gets back to the idea of being both aspirational and realistic. We want to make sure that we're presenting options that are feasible, supported by a clear roadmap going forward. Whether or not that involves taxes, it's something that we can explore. I don't know the appetite for that locally, but it's something that we can certainly look into.
So about the private equity investment,
Yeah.
one in 7 existing homes, residences and multifamily homes are owned by private equity firms, have been purchased by private equity firms in the United States. And it's 1 in 5 in Washington State.
Yeah.
So I don't know what it is in Lakewood, but this is having a huge impact on affordability. And there's no restriction on it.
Yeah, and this is something that's come up in a few communities that we've worked with. The balance here, and I agree with you in that this can be problematic. It can relate to increased rents in certain cases. But the other part of this is that we also need to consider broader needs for housing development that will include not only nonprofits, but community land trusts and other avenues for more affordable housing, but as well looking at market rate housing as well. So we do need to consider options that don't completely exclude certain groups from the market, just because there just needs to be a lot more housing production. There are other figures that we have that note that there are a lot of there are some households in Lakewood that are under renting, that are essentially that have higher household incomes than what would be necessary for qualifying for certain rental units. And there may be a need to free up some of the housing stock for more affordable units by accommodating at the higher end of the market as well. So. But it is an issue. I mean, there does need to be a broad effort that includes a number of different solutions. And these are certainly things that we're looking into.
And I would just add, Lydia, that the comments that you're making and questions that you're asking apply to more than just the city of Lakewood. They are across the county and into the state and even nationally. So appreciate that you're asking these questions, and we will certainly pass them along to others, but just understand that this won't be something that Lakewood can try to solve or completely solve on its own. Thanks.
Jason?
Yeah, so what Tiffany just said, I know it's something Lakewood can't solve on its own. Is part of this comprehensive plan going to be a roadmap on maybe some of the actions Lakewood will take, like how it what partnerships it's going to go try to develop, what, let's say, other state or federal funding options they may look at, that kind of thing?
The end result should be exactly that. What is it that the city is going to look to do over the next 10 to 20 years to address these housing needs? And it does need to be a good faith effort. It, you know, like Lydia was suggesting, these can be aspirational targets, and it's a real shame to not use this as a means to try to move forward issues of you know, addressing housing affordability. So the comprehensive plan should include that, yes. Is there something you wanted to add, Tiffany, on that?
No, thanks. You just took it where I was going to take it. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, that's what I like to hear. Okay, so I know that time is fleeting with this session. I did want to touch very briefly on climate change. One thing to note as well, if there are any other comments that you have, I can provide my email address. I'm more than happy to receive any other comments. And I believe that Tiffany also had included Lakewood Speaks, the website for comments on the comp plan. Super quickly with energy and climate change. Like I had mentioned before, the city already has an energy and climate change element incorporated into the comprehensive plan. And it has a number of different goals related to transportation, related to municipal policy, related to energy and sustainable development and hazards management. It's a large section. It was developed separately from updating other components of the comprehensive plan. One of our efforts has really been to integrate in this energy and climate change element into the rest of the comprehensive plan. And also to provide a, oh, am I not sharing my screen? Oh,
I see
sorry.
your screen.
Oh, okay. All right. That was a comment.
You're good.
Okay, great. There were a lot of different elements and in this, there were a lot of components of the climate change element. And what we were essentially trying to do as part of our work is to both streamline the element and provide an implementation plan going forward for the city to make some real achievements in climate change, in local climate change policy that would be integrated in with housing, with the transportation element, with capital facilities. So as part of our engagement, there were a lot of things that we were looking at, a lot of things we had asked people, a lot of responses that we had received from surveys that, you know, looking, for example, at efficient transportation options is tied in very strongly to supporting strong multimodal transportation networks and safe walking and biking routes, for example. So, you know, as we were going through, and this is just some of what we had heard as part of our engagement with I'll get into that in a minute, but as part of our engagement with the steering committee and through surveys and focus groups. But we were really trying to focus in on the things that people found to be important and the elements that would have the greatest leverage that the city could engage with. So looking at opportunities for prioritizing neighborhood planning that would encourage more climate, that would encourage types of development that would support climate change planning goals. Looking at adopting and enforcing building codes and other elements that would really start to make a difference and would allow Lakewood to contribute to addressing issues of climate change. This also includes adaptation as well as considerations of what the city can do to reduce impacts of reduce climate change, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and other issues like that. So as we were working through this, there were a number of different kind of there was a lot of feedback that we had received. What we're looking to focus in on as part of the recommendations, and I might need to, this goes to 1 o'clock, I believe, Casey.
Yes, it normally goes to 1, but we can go over a little bit if you need to.
That's fine. I'll be very brief. I have a lot of slides, and I just want to drill down to the basic elements that we're looking at. What we're looking to do as part of this is to provide a clear implementation plan. We're currently in the final stages of developing it out, but we're looking at 4 different categories of, clear actions that the city can take. Looking at opportunities for collaboration and partnership with other organizations in the area, opportunities to design sustainable neighborhoods that not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions from construction and from transportation use, but also encourage adaptation. Looking at prioritizing climate resiliency, looking at other ways through information and adaptation measures and mitigation that we can ensure that the impacts of climate are not that don't impact sensitive populations in the city, and looking at other opportunities to educate and engage the public through conservation programs, looking at partnerships with different housing and service providers to help implement climate change goals, and then just ongoing, efforts with education with the public about what Lakewood is doing and what Lakewood could be doing. So this is a very high-level summary. We're working on a draft to a full implementation strategy that we'll be submitting to the city, and we'll be moving forward in the process very soon. So, but this is important because we're also looking at integrating this into other considerations for the comprehensive plan update, looking at incorporating these considerations into transportation, looking at capital facilities, and as well as housing. And how is it that we both work to hit our housing targets that we've discussed and work to address the climate change goals that the city has been working towards. So I'm going to kind of end things here. There are a number of different slides in the slide deck in addition to this about some of the engagement that we've done, but I did want to take a few final questions before we depart.
So again, you can come off mute or raise your hand or post it in the chat.
This is not a question, more a comment. Ted Thielen, again, from the City of Lakewood. Just talking on housing, specifically with regard to JBLM in Lakewood's case, we have a unique situation where a lot of like E1 through E5, like the younger, kind of earlier into the military personnel, they do, they rent a lot essentially, and that puts a lot of pressure on our rental market. And I think what you were saying about serving sort of the higher end actually takes pressure off the lower end, because people are essentially, they can afford more, but are taking up a cheaper spot, if you will. Serving those military members, I think in Lakewood serves kind of a, you get like a double bonus off of it. So projects that serve that military base are fantastic. Just wanted to put that out there.
Any other questions or comments?
I have a question, Andrew. I think housing and climate is something that least in Pierce County, we haven't really had much of a conversation around it.
Mhm.
And I'm really curious to know how affordable housing providers can be more involved in this conversation around the climate stuff. Do you have any suggestions, especially with the comp plan stuff coming up?
Yeah, I think engagement in the comp plan process in Lakewood is great. But I think more broadly, I know that there are a number of different organizations that are looking at ways of pairing affordable housing with efforts towards energy conservation and climate resiliency. I would need to look them up to provide them to you. I don't have them immediately available. But I know as well that one other area to note, the recent effort to develop out a public housing authority in Seattle has included provisions to include energy efficiency and climate resiliency into the designs of new projects that they undertake. And that's certainly an interesting example of how that's been integrated in with mixed income and affordable housing planning and strategies going with different organizations. So
If I could, Andrew, I'll jump in as well, Amanda. As Andrew mentioned earlier, it is now required by state law that climate change and resiliency be incorporated into comprehensive planning. So as the consortium or League of Women Voters or anybody else is preparing how to approach this, not only with Lakewood, but everywhere, forming the message that housing and climate change are very closely related. As you have more and more extreme weather events because of climate change, that is going to probably, in most places, affect people at the lower end of the economic spectrum more so than others. And so just tying and reinforcing the fact that housing and climate change are very much related and need to be taken into account concurrently, along with transportation. That's another part of this latest update to the Growth Management Act by the state legislature. Is now there's a focus in transportation planning about climate change and resiliency as well. So it's making the message that, hey, these are all connected. We recognize that, and jurisdiction, whoever you may be, as you're doing your planning in 2024 and beyond, these need to be taken in conjunction with each other, not in a separate silo.
Mhm. One last note is that the Department of Commerce actually has a webpage devoted to advice to communities about how to incorporate climate change elements. So there may be some good resources there about what cities are considering and what advice they're getting that may be useful to review. So
Thank you.
So I put my email address in the chat. Thank you very much for your time. I could probably talk for hours about this, but if anybody has any other comments to follow up on, please, by all means, email me or provide comments with the to the lakewoodspeaks.org website that we're using for engagement on the comprehensive plan. So great.
All righty.
Thanks.
And for anyone that is on the there's going to be listening and watching the recording, since you can't see the chat, Andrew's email is andrew@BERK, BERK Consulting.com. That's helpful for anyone. Does anyone else have any last minute things to mention or ask really quick? All right. Okay.
As mentioned, please email me with any questions or concerns or about the presentation, and thank you for your time.
Absolutely. And just as a reminder, this is being recorded. We're hopefully going to get it up on our website by the end of today. So if you or anyone that you know is interested in reviewing this meeting at a later time, it'll be available to you then. And again, thank you for coming, and I hope you guys enjoyed the conversation, discussion, and found it helpful. And just as a reminder, by becoming a member with the Tacoma-Pierce County Affordable Housing Consortium, if you're a member, you get more of these great opportunities for conversation, access to member-only groups, resources, networking events, and that sort of thing as we continue our work on affordable housing. I'm going to put our website in the chat once more. It's just affordablehousingconsortium.org. So feel free to reach out to us via email or through our website. I'll put my email down in here as well. You can reach me at casey@tpcahc.org. So if you have any questions for me or the consortium. Again, thank you, everybody. And hopefully we can have another conversation later on down the line as things continue. If anybody's interested in that, we might chat about that. So look for other emails. And thank you again, Andrew and Tiffany and Amanda.